This is Revelation 16, the vials of wrath poured out, part 3. And in this part, I am continuing to look at the first vial of wrath and the details and the issues surrounding this. And it's important that we have this foundation sorted out because it's the launching pad into the rest of the chapter. Now, we are still considering the first vial of wrath being poured out and the time of the outbreak of the French Revolution. And in this next part, what I'm going to do is look at the causes of the French Revolution from a Christian perspective. Of course, there are many books written about the French Revolution and its causes, and that's all well and good. But we are interested in this from a Christian biblical perspective. What was going on in the spiritual side of things that brought all of this about, because that's going to get to the heart of the matter more than anything else. Mostly historians, they don't believe in God, so they ignore this aspect of things. They can't comment on it because they don't understand it. And of course, this means that the outcome of their analysis falls short of getting to the heart of the thing. Well, we're going to try and plug the gap here. To more clearly understand where I am coming from, let's consider ancient Israel for a moment and the reason why the kingdom of Israel fell to the Assyrians. Now, it was not because of a lack of arms, a lack of fortifications, or some other major natural catastrophe that made them vulnerable to an attack. Some of this may have been at play, their defences may have been weakened, but that's not the principal reason why the nation fell. 2 Kings 17, starting in verse 7, makes the matter crystal clear, and instead of reading the details, I will summarise it as follows. The nation had sinned. They had done their utmost to reject God. They walked in the ways of the heathen. They worshipped false gods. And it was because of this that the Lord rejected them, and the Lord brought down the Assyrians, which were the tool in his hand to spew the people out of the land. So it was a spiritual problem that was at the heart of why the kingdom of Israel fell. And similarly, now as we look at the French kingdom, there was this gross disease of a spiritual nature that was more prevalent in the French kingdom than any other place, and it was about to burst forth and spread far and wide. So with that in mind, let's look at the things that were in play just prior to the French Revolution that gave rise to the tremendous events that subsequently unfolded. Now, as we consider the events leading up to the French Revolution, one of the main drivers behind this was that France had removed the salt of the earth from their kingdom. Jesus said to his disciples, "Ye are the salt of the earth." Among other things, salt acts as a preservative. It slows down the decay of flesh. But if you have no salt, the flesh quickly goes rotten. Now, being the most Catholic of Catholic nations, what did France do? It systematically and ruthlessly killed the Christians, known as Huguenots in France, the very best of society, the most loyal and industrious of all the French subjects. The districts that these people inhabited were better cultivated and more flourishing than any other parts of France, and these people were persecuted and were driven from France in such massive numbers, it left behind only the basest kind of people, utterly devoid of any goodness. Here we see a famous massacre medal which was struck by order of Pope Gregory XIII to celebrate the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in Paris in August 1572, where tens of thousands of Huguenots, that's French Protestants, were murdered by Roman Catholics. This massacre crippled the Huguenots, and many of their prominent leaders were killed, and many more of the rank and file who were not murdered reconverted to Catholicism. It began in Paris and then spread throughout the entire country. French soldiers and the Roman Catholic clergy fell upon unarmed people, and blood flowed like a river throughout the entire country. Men, Women and children fell in heaps before the mobs. The rivers of France were so filled with corpses that for many months no fish were eaten, and in other parts wolves came down from the hills to feed upon the decaying bodies of the Huguenots. The papal clergy seized Protestant property and so held 1/5 of the land of France prior to the French Revolution. In this massacre medal we see the bust of Pope Gregory XIII on the one side, and on the other we see an angel depicting the Church of Rome offering the Huguenots the choice of death by the sword, and we see their bodies strewn on the ground before him, or alternatively worship of the crucifix, that is the Roman Catholic faith. And around the edge of this massacre medal we see the Latin phrase which means in English Huguenots slaughtered. The industry and skill of these Huguenots had contributed to the greatness of France, and without these people who were the salt of the earth, Roman Catholic France quickly became putrid. It went off, it became rotten in infidelity and immorality, and I'm going to talk more about this shortly. Through events like this and others that followed, at least 1 million Huguenots fled France and took with them their skills and industry, and nobody was left behind to restrain the people and the monarchy and the Roman Catholic Church. In the book The History of the Rise of the Huguenots of France, Volume 2, 1879, by Professor Henry Martin Baird, we read under the subheading, The Massacre of St. Bartholomew's Day, the following. And I'm just going to warn you that some of what I'm about to read is a little bit horrifying, and you may wish to pass over the next couple of minutes. We read this: The frenzy that had fallen upon Paris affected all classes alike. Every feeling of pity seemed to have been blotted out. Natural affection disappeared. A man's foes were those of his own household. On the plea of religious zeal, the most barbarous acts were committed. Spy Niquet, a poor bookbinder, whose scanty earnings barely sufficed to support the wants of his 7 children, was half roasted in a bonfire made of his own books, and then dragged to the river and drowned. The weaker sex was not spared in the universal carnage, and, as in a town taken by assault, suffered outrages that were worse than death. Matron and maiden alike welcomed as merciful the blow that liberated them from an existence now rendered insupportable. Women approaching maternity were selected for more excruciating torments, and savage delight as exhibited in destroying the unborn fruit of the womb. The very innocence of childhood furnished no sufficient protection. So literally did the pious Catholics of Paris interpret the oft-repeated exhortations of their Holy Father to exterminate not only the roots of heresy, but the very fibres of the roots. 2 infants, whose parents had just been murdered, were carried in a hod and cast into the Seine. A little girl was plunged naked in the blood of her father and mother, with horrible oaths and threats that, if she should become a Huguenot, the like fate would befall her. And a crowd of boys between 9 and 10 years of age was seen dragging through the streets the body of a babe yet in its swaddling clothes, which they had fastened to a rope by means of a belt tied about its neck. Over a few more pages we read, The carnival of blood, which had been so successfully ushered in on that ill-starred Sunday of August, was maintained on the succeeding days with little abatement of its frenzied excitement. Paris soon resembled a vast charnel house. The dead or dying lay in the open streets and squares. They blocked the doors and carriageways. They were heaped in the courtyards. When the utmost that impotent passion could do to these lifeless remains was accomplished, the Seine became the receptacle. Besides those Huguenots whom their murderers dragged to the bridges or wharves to dispatch by drowning, both by day and by night, wagons laden with the corpses of men and women, and even of young children, were driven down to the river and emptied of their human freight. Wow, what was done to these Huguenots with the participation and blessing of the Church of Rome is truly horrifying. And I had to record this several times when reading it out, as it's simply quite difficult to read it without choking up. When news of the massacre in Paris reached the Vatican, there was jubilation. Cannons roared, bells rung. Pope Gregory XIII declared a Jubilee day of public thanksgiving and prayed this prayer. Almighty and eternal God, who resisteth the proud and givest grace to the humble, we give thee devout thanks and sing unto thee songs of praise, because, regarding the faith of thy servants, thou hast granted unto the Catholic people a glorious and joyful victory. We beseech thee mercifully to continue what thou hast faithfully begun, to the praise and glory of thy name, which we thy servants suppliantly invoke, through Christ Jesus our Lord, etc. Here we have another massacre medal, which is believed to celebrate either the massacre of the Huguenots in the Cevennes or the siege of Nigemen in 1673. But with either event, the message of the medal is clear. On the one side, we see Louis XIV mounted on a horse, and around the edge are the Latin words which mean, by the grace of God, King of France and Navarre. On the reverse side, Louis XIV is depicted as Saint George with a lion at his feet, and Louis XIV is shown stomping on a gorgon, which is Medusa, and which symbolizes the Huguenots. Medusa's hair and fingers are seen consisting of snakes, and the message is clear. The Huguenots are an evil monster that has to be slain, and this is the same thing that we saw in the coinage of pagan Rome under Diocletian, where Christianity was depicted as the seven-headed hydra that the emperor was clubbing to death. Hovering over the king is a woman with a chalice in hand and a sunburst behind her head, and this symbolizes the Roman Catholic religion. Around the edge we see the Latin words which mean, "Who is against us?" and this is taken from part of the scripture which says, "If God be for us, who can be against us?" In 1681, Louis XIV introduced a policy known as dragonnades or dragonnades, which was introduced to intimidate Huguenot families into either leaving France or converting to Catholicism. Under this policy, ill-disciplined dragoons, being the king's soldiers, were forcibly billeted into Huguenot homes with the intention of persecuting, harassing and terrorizing these Huguenots. And under this policy, Protestant houses were turned into horses' stables, the women were forced into convents, wives and daughters were raped, children were taken from their families and brought up as Catholics, men were taken and used as galley slaves, their Bibles were burnt, the libraries were closed, and their material possessions were confiscated. And still the situation grew even worse, and a further nail was driven into the coffin of the Huguenots with the revocation of the Edict of Nantes by King Louis XIV. The Edict of Nantes was signed in April 1598 by King Henry IV of France, and granted the Huguenots substantial civil rights as well as religious toleration in this most Catholic of Catholic nations. From this article from Christianity.com, we read the following. Late in the 17th century, France declined from being the most powerful and rich nation in Europe to a country pressed to hold its own against powerful foes. Possibly, just possibly, one event above all helps to explain this decline. On October 18, 1685, King Louis XIV revoked the Edict of Nantes. In doing so, he drove hundreds of thousands of his best citizens abroad. Here we see a medal of King Louis XIV, which was struck to celebrate the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, and in this we see a woman with a cross upheld in one hand as a sign of victory, and a book is seen in the other hand. This figure represents the Roman Catholic faith, and she stands before a church building. In fact, she's standing in the way of the door to that building, and I suppose that this is indicating that the way to the church is through the Roman Catholic faith. Under her feet she is seen crushing a Huguenot, and that Huguenot laying on the ground there has books strewn out before him, and these may be depicting the translations of the New Testament into French, which of course was completely forbidden by the Church of Rome. Also, you can see in the fallen Huguenot's hand a smoking stick of some kind, and this may be indicating that their flame, their light, has been extinguished. Around the edge of this medal we can see the Latin phrase which means "Extinguish heresies, Edict of Nantes, October 1685. So Huguenot schools were closed, they were forbidden from gathering for worship, their buildings were destroyed, Bibles, hymnals and devotional books were burned, and they were forbidden from reading and preaching from the Bible. In the book The Huguenots, Their Settlements, Churches and Industries in England and Ireland by Samuel Smiles, we read of the response of the Church of Rome to the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, and under chapter 8, Renewed Flight of the Huguenots, we read this: "The Roman Catholic clergy were almost beside themselves with joy. The eloquent Bossuet was specially fervent in his praises of the monarch. Quote, 'Touched by so many marvels,' end quote, said he, 15th January 1686, quote, 'let us expand our hearts in praise of the piety of the great Louis. Let our acclamations ascend to heaven, and let us say to this new Constantine, quote, you have strengthened the faith, you have exterminated the heretics, King of heaven, preserve the King of the earth,' end quote." Here we see a satirical medal struck in France dealing with the persecution of the Huguenots following the revocation of the Edict of Nantes. In this medal we see the Pope, which is possibly Pope Innocent XI, with thunderbolts in one hand, which can remind us of the seven thunders or papal bulls and edicts spoken of in Revelation chapter 10, which were directed against the Protestants. In the other hand, the Pope proudly displays the keys to heaven and to hell. Now, from the Pope's body below, we see flowing from this a seven-headed hydra, which reminds us of the seven-headed dragon of Revelation chapter 12, which represented pagan Rome. And of course, that persecuting spirit that was in pagan Rome lives on in papal Rome. The Hydra can be seen devouring a Huguenot, a Protestant child, man and woman. On the right-hand side of the Pope, looking at this slide, we see a Jesuit holding a scroll which has the Latin words Concilia Decreta written on it, and this is referring to the papal councils and decrees directed against the Protestants. On the other side, there is a papal soldier with a sword and fetters in hand. Both the Jesuit and the papal soldier are shown supporting a chalice between them. Around the edge of this medal is the Latin phrase Supra Deum post Pernicium, which means above God then destruction, but I'm not really sure what these words are intended to mean in this context. On the reverse side of this same medal, we see a destroyed brick building on the right-hand side, and there we can see a dog eating a slain Huguenot. A dragoon is shown riding his horse, and on the left-hand side, it's either a man or a woman that has been hung. Others are shown below as being held captive. The dragoon is holding a sword in one hand and a chained Huguenot in the other, and in the distance we can see a crowd with possibly a cross and other banners on display, and this appears to be a crowd of clergy celebrating. Around the edge we see the Latin phrase ex martis palmae, and the straight reading of that is from martyrdom's palms, and once again I am not sure what is intended by this phrase. So we have looked at the removal of the salt of the earth from the French kingdom. Now we're going to move along and consider the rise of atheism. I suppose that it might seem remarkable to some, but we need to deal with this aspect of Catholicism, and that is full-blown Catholicism is the midwife of atheism and revolution. We are dealing with France, which was known as the most Christian of Christian nations, that is, the most Catholic of Catholic nations. They were the eldest daughter of the Church of Rome, so-called, the strong arm of the papacy. And then think of the words of Jesus. Jesus said, "By their fruits ye shall know them." And what was the fruit of this most Catholic of Catholic nations? Let's continue to think about this. The Church of Rome, still regarded by so many in the world today as the beacon of Christianity with the Pope at its head. This system is in fact the midwife of atheism, the very antithesis of biblical Christianity. Roman Catholicism is nothing other than veiled paganism, full of various superstitions and traditions which are an affront and repulsive to the thinking mind. The worship of relics, of bones, of pieces of the supposed cross of Christ, the praying to saints, the deification of the saints, the deification of Mary as the Queen of Heaven, bleeding statues, lying signs and wonders and visions, the myth of purgatory, the abomination of transubstantiation, and the list goes on, to the which we could add the cesspool of immorality and iniquity that is endemic with this system. These things are an insult to any thinking mind. Now, as Christians, of course, we believe in the supernatural and the miraculous, but what we have in the Church of Rome is nothing that can be compared with this. And so this is why so many countries who had embraced Catholicism and its variances as the only form of Christianity they had ever known have so easily fallen victim to atheistic communism. And this is quite simply what has come out of Roman Catholic France. Contrawise, those nations like Britain that embraced the Reformation and the open Bible, who now had the light of the truth of the gospel of Jesus Christ, were spared the dreadful effects of the French Revolution and communism that has subsequently ravaged many countries of the earth and led to the deaths of countless tens of millions of innocent people. From about 1758 to 1770, atheistic literature flooded into France. The circulation was enormous and was distributed in vast quantities among the lower classes. There were many writers of this material, but the most well known is Voltaire, called the Apostle of Infidelity, and he was born, note this, 9 years after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes. Voltaire was a deist, meaning that he believed in God based on reason rather than revelation, and that any religion and any God would do, whether this was in Islam, some Eastern religion, or anything else. And he wanted to destroy the Almighty God of the Bible, the God of Christianity. He wanted to get rid of the Christian religion and obliterate the Bible. And he was presented as a great philosopher, but in reality he was an initiate of the secret fraternal or brotherhoods that were developing in Europe at that time. Voltaire's so-called brilliant but ungodly teachings were to rush like a torrent into the void created by the expulsion from France of the gospel and the Huguenots who had proclaimed it. And for 50 years Voltaire was regarded as the leading intellectual in Europe, gaining the friendship of many of the crowned heads of Europe. So the seeds of terrible infidelity were sown in very rich soil. The Roman Catholic Church was the only church Voltaire knew. It was the only form of Christianity, basically, that he had, and he hated it. So he wrote about it, he mocked it, he denigrated it, he exposed its gross corruptions and superstitions, and his writings were widely circulated and read. And so by the time the French Revolution came. The people of the nation were ready to rip the thing to pieces. Voltaire exposed the gross corruptions and superstitions of Roman Catholicism, but he failed to recognize the truth, and in so doing he put nothing back in the place of that which he was tearing down. His concept of a supreme being any god quickly degenerated into the worship of the creature rather than the creator. He put in its place human reason and human intellect, and out of this came the French Revolution. Voltaire said things like this: "It took 12 ignorant fishermen to establish Christianity. I will show the world how one Frenchman can destroy it. And also, if there be no God, we would invent one." Now, there was another aspect of things working behind the scenes that is surrounded in controversy and even more darkness, and I'm not going to pretend that I know all the details, as I don't. But this is in relation to a man called Adam Weishaupt, who was not only a Jew but also a Jesuit professor of theology in Bavaria. In 1773, or possibly 1774, I think it was, Pope Clement XIV suppressed the Jesuits on the advice from the King of France, as they were regarded as a great danger to the French kingdom. And if you recall, the Jesuits are the special forces of the Church of Rome. They are highly trained, very effective, and deadly opponents. The suppression of the Jesuits in the French kingdom in turn pushed the Jesuits underground, and they plotted to overthrow the French monarchy and take control of the papacy. Pope Clement XIV subsequently died. Many believe he was poisoned by the Jesuits, although this is disputed, as you can expect. Adam Weishaupt formed the secret society known as the Illuminati, and it was their aim to foment rebellion, violence, and the overthrow of the established order, so that, as they say, out of chaos comes order, the order that they have established themselves. So we have atheism flourishing in the void created by the loss of the Huguenots from the French kingdom. As well, we have the Illuminati working secretly to overthrow the French monarchy using revolution and violence. All of this was a festering boil on the body of the French kingdom, which was about to explode and erupt its disgusting contents, firstly into France, and then spread its deadly poison throughout the rest of Europe and abroad. The two great pillars of France at this time were, number one, an absolute monarchy, and number two, a hierarchical church system, the Church of Rome, and these two operated and cooperated with each other to support the French nation, and both of these pillars were rotten to the core. Concerning the general moral state of France at the time of the French Revolution, we read from Lardner's Outlines of Universal History. The title of this book is so long I can't fit it all in. Lardner's Outlines of Universal History, 1835. In chapter 8, Times of the French Revolution and Empire, State of Europe, and it says this concerning France: "A court corrupt and profligate beyond, perhaps, any which Europe had yet witnessed, had utterly degraded the minds of the upper classes of society. The efforts of the virtuous Louis XVI to stem this torrent were unavailing. National vice was not to escape its merited chastisement. The middle orders were disgusted and galled by the privileges of the noblesse, and their excessive pride and insolence. The writings of the philosophers and the scandalous lives of many of the clergy had shaken their reverence for religion. The abuses and oppression of arbitrary and extravagant government were keenly felt." In Sir Archibald Alison's book, History of Europe from the Commencement of the French Revolution, etc., Volume 1, we read this: "The reign of Louis XV is the most deplorable in French history. The whole frame of society seemed to be decomposed. It is difficult to treat of this subject without disclosing particulars at which purity may blush, or on which licentiousness may gloat. All that we read in ancient historians, veiled in the decent obscurity of a learned language, of the orgies of ancient Babylon, was equalled, if not exceeded, by the nocturnal revels of the Regent Orleans, the Cardinal Dubois, and his other licentious associates. They would exceed belief, if not narrated on the undoubted testimony of concurring eyewitnesses. Nor were the manners improved on the accession of Louis XV, for although, during his earlier years, his manners were correct, and he was enthusiastically beloved by his subjects, yet as he advanced in life, he fell under the government of successive mistresses, each more dissolute and degraded than her predecessor, until at length decorum was so openly violated at court that even the corrupted circles of Versailles were scandalized by the undisguised profligacy which was exhibited. And then over a few more pages, Sir Archibald Allison says, without polluting these pages by the details of the private life of other members of the family, it is sufficient to say that the dissipations of Duc de Chartres, afterwards so well known in Paris as Duke of Orleans, and who ultimately perished on the scaffold, were carried to a length of which modern Europe had not hitherto exhibited an example. The Roman Catholic writer Hilaire Belloc said in his book The French Revolution the following: "The bishops found nothing remarkable in seeing a large proportion of their body to be loose livers, or in some cases openly presenting their friends to their mistresses, as might be done by any lay noble around them." And in the same book, back in the preface, Hilaire Belloc says, "It is impossible to understand the revolution unless very high relief is given to the religious problem." Still further, as we consider the state of the morals of the ruling class of France immediately preceding the outbreak of the revolution, we read from Walter Scott's book called The Life of Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French, with a preliminary view of the French Revolution, Volume 1, the following: "The licentiousness which walked abroad in such disgusting and undisguised nakedness was a part of the unhappy bequest left by the Regent Duke of Orleans to the country which he governed. The decorum of the court during the times of Louis XIV had prevented such excesses. If there was enough of vice, it was at least decently veiled, but the conduct of Orleans and his minions was marked with open infamy, deep enough to have called down, in the age of miracles, an immediate judgment from heaven, and crimes which the worst of the Roman emperors would have at least hidden in his solitary Isle of Capria, were acted as publicly as if men had no eyes, or God no thunderbolts. From this filthy cocytus flowed those streams of impurity which disgraced France during the reign of Louis XV, and which, notwithstanding the example of a prince who was himself a model of domestic virtue, continued in that of Louis XVI to infect society, morals, and above all, literature." And in the Horae Apocalypticae, Eliot sums up the matter by saying, "Such was the state of French morals, and so originated at the time of the outbreak of the Revolution." And indeed, it is remarkable that the very derangement of the national finances, which was the primary cause that necessitated the convocation of the Revolutionary States General, had arisen in no little measure from this cause. When the Revolution broke out, the vitiation of the moral sense of the nation thus accomplished prepared them for the flood of yet fouler impurity which then inundated all society in France. And thereby all the sacred and humanizing domestic ties having been thus confounded, for those brutal ferocities which were acted out at the same time, and which were but indeed the natural accompaniments of such brutal licentiousness. And with that, I'll end Revelation 16, part 3.